Hey everybody, Dr. Dave Marquis here, and I wanted to talk to you about something that comes up almost every single day. And it has to do with our diet. It's something that's really common to most of our diets, and that has to do with dairy. And I was originally thinking of an inflammatory title for this, like Death by Dairy, but I don't want to like freak people out about dairy, but I get asked this question so often that I thought that I should put together maybe a video just to give the bullet points, and then maybe another time something that's much more in depth, because it really is a broad conversation. So I'm going to try and be succinct here. The concept of dairy intolerance isn't linear. There's three main pathways that people can have an adverse response or reaction to dairy. One is to lactose, and that's the one that most people are familiar with. They say, oh, you're lactose intolerant, meaning that if you consume something with dairy, you might get gassy and bloated. So you kind of know it right here. That's one aspect, and that has to do with that person not having enough of the enzyme lactase to break down that milk sugar. And so they get those symptoms. That's not really an allergy. That's an enzymatic insufficiency. And it is uncomfortable, but it's something that's not life-threatening at all. And then there's two proteins in dairy that are really commonly triggers for people that they can't break down well. And that one tends to be more immunological, meaning that their immune system gets involved in the process. One of those proteins is whey. You can kind of think of that as the creamy stuff at the top of the milk that we love to turn into butter or ice cream or other yummy things. And then the other one is casein. Casein is a whole story unto itself, so I'm going to try and hit a couple of bullet points on that in just a moment. But casein is the binding protein found in dairy, and it's what allows it to turn into curd, so you can make like cottage cheese or cheese in general. In fact, the harder the cheese, theoretically, the more casein that you have there, because it's been binding and it's really rigid. Okay, so you got these three things that different people might not be able to manage well. Rarely is it all three for an individual. But depending on which one it is, the types of symptoms that they might have can be completely different. So I already mentioned the gas and bloating from the lactose. Well, on the whey and the casein, you can have a variety of other symptoms, and they can be neurological. You can have brain fog, you can get migraines. You can actually go to the extent, because the casein in particular has the capacity to pass our blood-brain barrier. I won't go into that one right now because that's saved for that deeper conversation. But let's just say it's not good. When those proteins end up inside the brain and your immune system is going after them, that can lead to neurodegenerative diseases, things where we demyelinate. And that leads to a whole array of symptoms, much greater than brain fog. I mean, it actually can start to interrupt how well you function as a human being. So, the other day I was sitting down and I was talking with a gentleman that had casein antibodies on his food panel. And he was saying, so how bad is dairy for me? And is it something that I'll be able to get back into my diet again? And I was like, well, that's a really good question, and it's a kind of a broad question, and a lot of people have that same question. And I said, let me give you a little bit of story. So I told him the things that I just shared with you. And then I said, but here's a little backstory on that. Like when you go into the grocery store, you might find on the shelf a bottle of A2 milk. And you go, what does that mean, A2? Well, it has to do with this casein topic. Because somewhere way back when, people started to notice that certain cows could produce more milk than others. And they said, wow, I want one of those cows because they make more food for us. And those cows started to be bred together so that you could have higher producing cows. And we've done this with other foods over time, and things like grains. I'll talk about that in that other video as well. And each time that we as humans have started to play with the hybridizing or modifying of a food chain, it's had an effect on our immune system. And that's why we've got this new milks that you'll find on store shelves called A2. It's actually not so new now. It's been around for many years, but people are still not really that familiar with it. What's unique about it is that they found that the protein, that casein, if the amino acid structure, that's what makes a protein, a whole bunch of amino acids, is subtly changed, it becomes less or more allergenic. So this A1 beta casein that we've been exposed to for most of our lives happens to be the one that can be most inflammatory and also the one that can cross the blood-brain barrier and create inflammation there. Whereas this A2 line seems to produce far less inflammation because the immune system seems to recognize it better. So that's something that I was sharing with this gentleman. I said, well, you know what? I don't know how long you're going to have to avoid dairy for, but I do know that in this form, right now, it's inflaming you in ways that you might not even understand because you're not necessarily symptomatic right now relative to that inflammation. And this is the insidious and kind of creepy thing about some foods when they cross the blood-brain barrier. So when people ask me about dairy, you kind of get the idea that it's not a simple conversation because it's going to be unique to that individual, their genetics, what enzymes they lack, what their immune system has interacted with previously, and it can kind of broaden out from there. So I encourage people to do food antibody testing so that they can get an idea of where do they sit on this whole platform. Are there things in that family that just don't work well for them? And if that's the case, then they can guide their diet more appropriately to reduce their systemic inflammation and get on with their life. So this conversation about dairy really does extend into other food concepts. It's not isolated to that one protein, but it is something that I think everyone should be aware of because different people have different responses. I've seen patients where it's something like a rash on the inside of their thighs. I've seen other people that get a migraine and are completely congested within a couple minutes of taking a bite. I've seen other people where it affects their brain in such ways that they actually start to slur their speech because it's affecting their cerebellum or their part of their brainstem. So you can see it's a broad array of symptoms when somebody's not doing well with a certain dietary protein, and dairy can be one of those. Take the time to evaluate your own diet, and doing blood tests with your doctor that allow you to look at IgA and IgG antibodies is one of the best ways to do that. It gives you an objective view that you can make rational choices from relative to your diet, and there are a lot of options that you can bring back into your world of food that aren't dairy based if we're talking about that specifically. There's so many companies that have stepped up to the plate to use different other protein sources to make really good dairy alternatives. And I'll try and address some of those things in another video when I do a deeper dive. But for now, I just wanted to share that concept that, yeah, dairy can be a good food for many people, but for others, it can have a broad array of symptoms, and some of them can be really insidious and potentially life-threatening over the long haul. So know that about yourself. And that's the beauty of living in the day that we do, because there's tests available to allow you to figure that out. Find yourself a good functional medicine practitioner that will allow you to do those tests so that you can ask those questions for yourself. Be well and have a great day.